In a remote desert watchtower, a woman who has never aged lives untouched by time until 5 mysterious riders arrive, each with their own purpose. Witness the unfolding story of solitude, secrets, and unexpected encounters that will change her eternal life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. The watchtower had no name, just as the woman who lived within it had none. Travelers passing through the empty lands whispered about it in hushed tones, pointing at the jagged silhouette rising from the barren ground, its stones older than memory, older than the towns and trails that came and vanished around it. She had lived there longer than anyone could remember, yet no one could say they had ever seen her change. They said her hair, long and dark as a raven's wing, had never turned gray, that her eyes were not bound by time, carrying a silence that made men uneasy. The tower's narrow windows sometimes glowed with candlelight deep into the night, though none dared knock on her door. To the ranchers she was a ghost, to the drifters she was a legend, to the children she was a figure in bedtime warnings. Don't wander near the tower, for the woman within watches forever and does not age. Years piled upon years, and still she remained. And then, one evening, as the sun bled red over the plains, 5 riders appeared on the horizon. Their horses moved in silence, dust trailing behind like the breath of the earth itself. They rode with a purpose that was heavy and unspoken, the kind of weight that meant they were not passing through, they were seeking. When they reached the base of the watchtower, the leader dismounted, a man broad-shouldered and grim, his hat shadowing eyes that studied the door as if it concealed answers older than he was. His voice broke the dry stillness. "We're looking for the woman who never aged." Inside, the woman stilled. The tower's stones seemed to lean closer around her, as if they too were listening. She had been waiting, though she could not say for how long, for she no longer measured life in years or seasons. Her hand brushed against the old wooden door, her breath even, her eyes calm, but with a depth that hid storms long past. For the first time in decades, someone had spoken the truth aloud. She knew the riders would not leave until they found her. Who do you think these 5 riders truly are? Men of justice, men of vengeance, or seekers of something far stranger? Share your thoughts in the comments. The silence inside the watchtower was unlike any silence found in the open plains. It pressed down like an invisible hand, heavy and expectant, and for the woman within, it had been her closest companion for decades. She moved slowly along the wooden floorboards, her bare feet making no sound, her hand brushing against the stone walls, worn smooth by time. Through the narrow slit of a window, she saw them 5 figures, distant but unmistakable, their horses kicking up lines of dust that spread like veins into the sunset. They were still miles off, but already she felt the rhythm of their approach in her chest, like an echo she could not shake. She had seen countless riders in her years, men who came for food, for water, for shelter, for answers they did not deserve, but something about these 5 made her turn away from the window faster than she had ever done before. She crossed to the small table, where a single candle burned, its wax dripping into thick pools that hardened into strange shapes resembling maps she had long since memorized. She pulled out a leather pouch, its ties frayed, its contents forgotten by everyone but her. Inside was a folded scrap of parchment, brittle at the edges, ink faded into near oblivion. She had not touched it in years. She did not need to. Every line was etched into her memory. Still, her hand trembled as she unfolded it now, as though those riders had stirred something dormant. She read the words in silence, her lips not moving, the language older than the dust, older than the stones, older even than the bones buried beneath the plains. The woman had lived through enough to know that age was a word that did not belong to her. Seasons had passed, generations had shifted, and towns had risen and fallen, yet she remained unchanged. Where others bent with time, she stood unbroken, and that alone was enough to turn her into a whispered story. Some called her cursed, some blessed, Others said she was a phantom conjured by grief. But she knew the truth, and the truth was that time itself had turned its face away from her, refusing to claim her. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, carried by the evening wind. She moved to the door, her palm resting on the thick wood, not to open it but to feel the vibration that pulsed through it. The riders were close now, closer than she would have liked. She whispered something, not a prayer, but a word that tasted foreign, forgotten. The candle flickered violently, as if in answer. Her gaze lingered on the empty chair by the hearth, where once, many years ago, a man had sat, a man who had known her secret and had ridden into the desert, never to return. She wondered if these riders came for the same reason, to take what was not theirs, to demand answers from a woman who did not belong to the natural order. The horses stopped. She heard leather creak, boots crunching against the dry soil. 5. Shadows loomed against the watchtower walls. A knock came, not soft, but measured, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried both patience and threat. She did not move. She let the silence answer for her. Then a voice called out, deep and calm, yet heavy with something unspoken. "We ride for the woman who never aged." She closed her eyes, and the weight of countless years pressed against her like chains. They had found her again. The nights along the ridge were long and bitter, and she had grown used to the sound of silence pressing against her bones. For years she had stood in the shadow of the watchtower that bore no name, her eyes scanning horizons no map had marked. The stones beneath her hands were older than memory, crumbling but strong, holding secrets like a graveyard holds ghosts. They said she never aged, that her hair silver even before most had lines upon their faces, had not changed in decades. They said her eyes were older still, carrying the weight of storms that had broken mountains and rivers that had long since dried. She had heard all of it, and she had never bothered to deny it. After all, to deny it would mean she was like them, fragile, finite, bound to the slow decay of time. And she knew well enough she was not. That evening the air shifted. She had sensed the riders before the dust of their horses reached her sight, as if the earth itself warned her of their coming. The 5 men rode in silence, their faces half covered. Against the cutting wind, their hats pulled low. They did not ride like outlaws seeking prey, nor soldiers carrying orders, but like pilgrims approaching a graveyard, hesitant, respectful, and heavy with unspoken intent. She had seen men like these before, and each time they had come, they had asked the same questions, about her name, about her years, about the curse they whispered she carried. She stood on the balcony of the tower as they drew close, her cloak pressed back by the wind, her hand resting on the wooden rail polished smooth by decades of waiting. When they stopped at the foot of the hill, the tallest of them dismounted first. He carried no weapon in his hand, but his eyes were sharp, searching, as though he sought to match the myths he had heard with the flesh and blood figure before him. "Are you?" he asked, voice low but steady, "the woman who never aged?" She did not answer at once. The wind carried the echo of his words up the stone walls like a hymn returning from a canyon. She watched them, 5 men, hardened by miles of road, and dust hesitating like children before the threshold of an old church. She knew what they wanted, because it was always the same. Some came seeking answers, some came seeking healing, and some came hoping to uncover a truth that would undo. Them. At last she spoke, her voice neither harsh nor kind, but cut with the clarity of water from an ancient spring. "Names change, faces fade. What does it matter what you believe I am?" The men glanced at one another, unease shifting among them. Only the leader held her gaze, his jaw tightening as though he had rehearsed this moment too many nights under. "The stars, because we've ridden far to find you," he said. "And we do not leave without the truth." Her lips curved, not a smile, but the ghost of one, as the wind howled across the barren ridge. She had heard those words before, many times from men who never returned the way they came. The tower had never known such silence, not even in its loneliest years. Silence had a weight when men waited outside its door, and the woman inside could feel the press of it through the very stone. She sat at the table, the candle burning low, its wax running like rivers down to a chipped saucer. The untouched bread before her hardened, and the water in the cup reflected her face, unchanged, unbroken by time. She thought of the writer's words again. That question carried on a voice both demanding and pleading. Where is the woman who never aged? She could not answer it, because to answer meant to admit the truth of what she had become, or perhaps always was. The writers had not left. She could hear their murmurs at the base of the tower, faint through the wind. They did not shout, did not threaten. Instead, they waited, as if time were theirs to command as easily as it had become hers. When the candle bent lower, she climbed the narrow stair to the window slit. Looking down, she saw them not as outlaws or hunters, but as pilgrims. Each man knelt in turn, laying down something at the foot of the watchtower. A carved bone, a rusted key, a crow's feather, a shard of obsidian, a bundle of sage tied with twine. Offerings, not weapons, her breath caught, though she had not breathed in surprise for many lifetimes. These were tokens meant for someone they revered, someone they feared. But she was no saint, and certainly no goddess. She was simply a woman who had once prayed too hard, or sinned too deep, or perhaps been cursed by something older than either prayer or sin. She remembered the river that had once flowed at the tower's edge, how she had bent to drink from it as a young girl. She had tasted the cold water, and afterward, time had simply stopped. Now 5 riders waited, their faces obscured by dusk and shadow. She felt the pull of their presence like a tide, urging her to open the door. But the door had not opened. In decades. To do so now would be to invite a reckoning long denied. She pressed her palm against the wood, rough and splintered beneath her skin, and whispered to herself words that had no sound. At last, the wind shifted. It carried a voice upward, soft but commanding. We know you are there. We do not seek to harm, we seek to understand. Show yourself. And she stood, the weight of centuries on her shoulders, knowing the night would not end in silence. The night crept in with the silence of something ancient, as though it had witnessed this land long before names or borders, and would remain long after. The watchtower stood tall, skeletal against the silver light of the moon, its stones cold, with centuries of wind and dust. Inside, the woman who never aged lit a lantern, shielding the flame as though protecting a secret. Its glow carved her face in halves, one side golden, warm, fragile, the other swallowed by shadow, eternal, unknowable. Below, the land stretched empty, save for the restless movements of horses shifting in the night. The 5 riders had not left. Their silhouettes lingered on the edges of the desert floor like phantoms stitched into the horizon, their purpose holding them still. She felt them waiting, not in haste but in patience, as if they understood time differently, or perhaps as if they knew time bent differently around her. The desert air pressed through the open slits of the tower, carrying a chill laced with memory. Her eyes drifted beyond the flame to the land where a river had once carved life into the dust, now long vanished, leaving only scars in the earth that mirrored her own unseen wounds. She closed her eyes, hearing faint echoes, the laughter of a child, the roar of floodwater, the cries of men who had come searching before. Always they came searching, always with questions, and always with the hunger to possess what they could not understand. Tonight, though, something was different. The riders had not shouted her name. They had not demanded her presence. They simply waited. Their silence unnerved her more than any threat could. She set the lantern down beside her and brushed her fingers across the stones of the wall, as if listening for whispers locked in their cracks. The watchtower remembered everything. Each stone had been laid by hands she once knew, hands now long buried. Some nights, she swore the tower spoke back groaning under the weight of stories it alone carried. Stories no one alive remembered but her. And yet, she felt the pull. A weight in her chest told her the riders were not here for the legend of the Ageless woman, not merely to confirm whispers passed between travelers at firesides. No, they were here for something else, something that reached deeper than myth. She leaned her head against the cold wall and breathed in slow, steady, as if preparing for an answer she already knew but dreaded to speak. The flame of the lantern flickered, and for the briefest second, her reflection in the iron plate seemed to change her eyes younger, her hair darker, her skin untouched by years. She recoiled from it, from herself. Outside, one of the horses snorted, restless. She stiffened. She knew what came next, though the form it would take remained hidden in the folds of the night. Always there was a moment, a crack in the silence, where fate revealed its next step. She gripped the edge of the lantern tighter, bracing, her heart steady not from calm, but from the heavy knowledge of repetition. The desert was patient, but destiny was not. Something was moving closer, closer. Still, and though she could not see it, she could feel its breath against her skin. The riders would not wait forever. The horizon shifted with the pale light of approaching dawn, washing the desert in muted shades of violet and gray. The woman remained on the balcony of her watchtower, her eyes fixed on the distant figures of the 5 riders who had not moved. Since nightfall, their silence was a weight she could almost touch, pressing against the stones beneath her feet. Years of solitude had taught her to read the smallest signs, the twitch of a horse's ear, the soft brush of sand against leather, the rhythm of distant breaths. Nothing escaped her, for she had nothing else to do but observe the world with a patience that outlasted decades. Yet this morning carried a different tension, one that her long years had never prepared her for. The riders were deliberate, synchronized. A unit formed not by chance, but by intention. They waited for her to act, yet they themselves remained still. She traced her fingers along the cold balcony rail, feeling the grooves worn by centuries of wind and rain. The land below, empty and unforgiving, mirrored her own isolation, a silence so vast it seemed to stretch beyond memory. Inside the watchtower, the air smelled faintly of old stone and dust, the scent of permanence that could not be disturbed. She turned back, moving past the ladder that led to the room where she slept, untouched by time. There, on the floor, lay scattered remnants of her life, a tattered journal, a wooden comb, a small bundle of dried herbs pressed together for warmth and ritual. She gathered the journal, the leather soft and familiar under her fingers, and opened it, reading lines she had written in youth, and which still held the same weight now. Each word was a link to her own unchanging existence, a record of a life that had stretched beyond ordinary measure. The riders remained below, shadows against a desert washed in the light of first day. One dismounted, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if the ground itself demanded courtesy. A small pouch hung at his side, worn leather with the patina of travel. He bent to lift it, hesitated, and then held it aloft for her to see. Inside was a bundle of simple cloth, tied with twine. She recognized the weave instantly, though it had been many decades since such patterns were made by hand. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke from distant campfires. The object was small, humble, yet it contained a significance. She had not expected to encounter again. Her breath was steady, but her pulse quickened. Time had made her vigilant. Centuries of quiet had forged a rhythm to which only she was attuned. She considered stepping down, confronting the riders, revealing the depth of what she had become. Yet she hesitated. To move was to risk the delicate balance between the world of the living and the unchanging life she inhabited. Still, the silent gesture from below demanded acknowledgement, a recognition that her solitude could no longer remain unquestioned. Wind rose, lifting sand into the air, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the weight of all the years pressing against her chest. The years she had counted, not in days or months, but in the echo of a universe that had grown old around her while she stayed the same. Her hand rested on the balcony rail, fingers curling around stone, and her eyes narrowed as she measured the riders, their purpose, and the invisible threads tying them to her own strange, enduring existence. Dawn deepened. The desert awaited the next move, and so did she. The morning grew stronger, its golden rays slicing through the desert air and spilling across the stones of the Watchtower. She had grown accustomed to mornings that carried nothing but silence, yet today felt different. The desert whispered. Around her, each wind gust a messenger from the past, hinting at secrets long buried and now stirring. She tightened the folds of her cloak, the fabric heavy and familiar, a shield against the harsh wind and the intrusion of those who dared approach. The 5 riders below did not move. They watched, their patience unmatched, their intent palpable. The air between her and them held the weight of years, of memories, of choices never spoken aloud. She descended the narrow steps inside the tower, the worn wood creaking beneath her careful weight. Her gaze swept over the room where dust motes floated lazily in shafts of light, settling on the remnants of her long solitary existence. A journal lay open on the table, pages filled with notes, sketches, and records of the countless days she had endured. She touched the pages lightly, tracing her fingers along words that had been written in moments of joy, fear, and anticipation. Time had been her only companion, and yet it had aged her not a single day. Below, the riders shifted, one adjusting the straps of his saddle while another muttered something under his breath, though the words were lost to the wind. The tallest rider, always silent, took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a small knife at his side. Though it was a weapon, it was clear he did not intend to use it here. They were not here to fight. They were here to understand, to seek something that had been shrouded in mystery for as long as she could remember. She reached the balcony once more, standing tall against the rising sun, her figure cutting a stark silhouette. The desert stretched infinitely before her, the stones warm beneath the morning light. Each rider was a shadow against this vast canvas, yet together they formed a pattern that the woman could read without words. There was purpose, there was reverence, and above all, there was patience. The kind of patience that had been her companion for decades, now mirrored by strangers who had traveled far and long. The wind carried faint scent sage, horse leather, and dust that had traveled across miles of unforgiving land. Each scent tugged at memories she had buried long ago. Faces of men she had once known, whispers of laughter, fleeting glimpses of love, and moments of sorrow all seemed to converge in that single breath of morning air. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of centuries settle on her shoulders. And yet something stirred inside her, a faint reminder that life, even after decades of solitude, could still surprise. Her eyes met the tallest riders once more, and in that instant, she understood. Their journey had not merely been about distance or direction. It had been about discovery, about encountering the extraordinary in a world that had almost forgotten it existed. Today, the Watchtower would no longer be just a sentinel of silence. It would be the place where old legends and new beginnings met, where the woman who never aged faced not just strangers, but destiny itself. By midday, the sun had climbed high, casting harsh light over the desert that surrounded the Watchtower. The ageless woman remained at her post, her figure steady against the stone balcony, every movement precise, calculated, and patient. She had spent centuries understanding the rhythms of the land, the subtleties of silence, and the ways in which time could bend around her presence. The 5 riders below, though patient, now began to shift, subtle movements betraying curiosity and anticipation. Their horses pawed at the ground, throwing up small clouds of dust that shimmered in the sunlight. The woman watched all of it, every flicker, every motion, with the awareness of one who had waited lifetimes for a single encounter. Like this dot inside the Watchtower, The air was thick with the scent of old stone and worn wood. A faded tapestry hung crookedly on one wall, depicting a scene long forgotten but held by the tower like a memory frozen in time. She ran her fingers over the coarse fibers, recalling the hands that had once created it, hands now long returned. To dust, the small table by the window held remnants of her daily life, a cup of water untouched, a journal with ink faded to brown, a knife that had seen centuries of use. She picked up the knife, weighing it in her hand, the cold steel reminding her that while her body did not age, danger never truly left the world. The tallest rider had begun to approach the tower, moving slowly as if every step carried a measure of reverence. The others followed, forming a semicircle around the base, their eyes fixed on the balcony above. They brought with them offerings, not of gold or silver, but of tokens, items crafted by hands that had long disappeared from the world. A carved bone, a small woven charm, a feather wrapped in twine, a fragment of a mirror, and a folded piece of leather with strange inscriptions. Each held significance, though the meaning was their own to understand. She knew instinctively that their intent was respect, a request for her acknowledgement. For centuries, she had learned the language of symbols, the weight of gestures, and the significance of intent. And in this moment, as she observed the offerings laid at the base of the tower, she understood. These men were not hunters. They were seekers. Seekers of stories, of truths, and perhaps of connection to something eternal that the world had long forgotten. She felt the stirrings of something she had not felt in decades, curiosity tempered by caution, the pull of engagement shadowed by the need for restraint. She exhaled slowly, letting the heat of the sun warm her shoulders. A flicker of a smile touched her lips, though the corners never reached her eyes. The Watchtower, which had once been her prison and her sanctuary, now became the stage for an encounter that would redefine the solitude she had known. With one last glance at the items below, she realized that the story of her life, which had seemed frozen, was now entering a new chapter. And the riders, patient and unwavering, waited for her next move, the desert holding its breath around them, as time itself seemed to pause, balancing delicately between past and future, between legend and reality. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in vivid shades of orange and deep purple, casting long shadows that stretched across the stones of the watchtower and the rough, uneven ground below. The ageless woman moved slowly, deliberately, descending the spiral stairs that had been her domain for countless years. Each step was measured, every sound muted by the weight of time she carried in her bones. The 5 riders waited below, their horses shifting restlessly, yet none dared to break. A silence that hung heavy in the cooling air. They had come seeking a story, a legend, a truth that had remained untouched for decades, and now they stood at the threshold of revelation. She stepped onto the balcony and took a deep breath, inhaling the dry desert air, tasting the grit and the whispers of centuries past. Her eyes scanned the riders, noting the subtle signs of anticipation in their posture, the tense hands gripping reins, the slight lean forward as if drawn toward something intangible. Time had slowed, each heartbeat echoing against the canyon walls and in the hollow of the tower, marking the culmination of her long vigil. The tallest rider, who had led the journey in silence, took a cautious step forward, holding out a small weathered satchel. Inside were items they had gathered along their path, trinkets and relics that carried weight not in gold, but in memory and intention. A carved pendant from a distant town, a letter folded with care, a handful of stones collected from forgotten trails, each offering a fragment of connection to the world she had chosen to leave behind. She reached down and accepted the satchel, feeling the textures of life that had grown up around her absence. For the first time in decades, she spoke. Her voice was soft, yet it carried across the desert, steady and unwavering. Words she had. Thought lost to time shaped the air, bridging the gap between her solitude and the presence of these strangers. She listened as they replied, their voices tentative but filled with respect. And in that exchange, the Watchtower, long a monument to isolation, became a meeting place of understanding, a convergence of past and present. The desert wind rose, lifting dust and sand, circling around the riders and the woman alike. It seemed to carry fragments of stories untold, echoes of lives that had intersected with her own, each whispering in tandem with the others. She felt the pull of choice, whether to retreat once more into the tower or step fully into this new chapter. Her hand lingered on the stone railing, feeling the cold permanence beneath her fingers, but her gaze lifted to the horizon, where endless sky promised change. With a deliberate movement, she descended fully, joining the riders below. The horses shifted, sensing her presence, while the riders' eyes reflected awe, recognition, and curiosity. The boundary between legend and reality blurred as she walked among them. No longer distant, no longer a shadow in the tower, but an ageless woman engaging with the world she had observed for so long. The desert, vast and eternal, watched silently, acknowledging the union of solitude and connection, the meeting of time and intention, and the beginning of a story that would ripple across generations yet to come. Her journey, long and unbroken, had reached a moment where the past and present intertwined, and for the first time in many lifetimes, she realized that even someone untouched by age could find belonging, trust, and the possibility of shared stories. The first light of morning stretched across the desert like a brush on a blank canvas, coloring the Watchtower in shades of orange and pale gold. The woman, who had lived in isolation for decades, felt the familiar pull of a day that promised change. It had been years, maybe centuries, since anyone had approached her tower without fear, without seeking to steal the secrets she carried. These 5 riders, however, carried neither weapons nor malice. They brought intent, a purpose, unspoken yet heavy in its presence. The stones beneath her feet vibrated faintly with the rhythm of hooves, a heartbeat that echoed across the empty plains and resonated within her own chest. She had long abandoned the need to speak first. Words could be dangerous, invitations to misunderstandings and betrayal. Instead, she observed them from the balcony, her silhouette stark against the rising sun. Each rider bore a look of reverence, as though they had come to witness something ancient and sacred. Their hats cast shadows over faces lined with the wear of travel, yet their posture was cautious, respectful, acknowledging a power they did not dare name. Inside the tower, the air was thick with the scent of old stone and lingering candle wax. The woman turned slowly, walking past worn tapestries that had long lost their color but retained their meaning. She touched the wall lightly, feeling every groove and crack, every imperfection that carried decades of memory. Time had etched her presence into these stones, marking her as both guardian and prisoner. She opened a small wooden box she had kept hidden, revealing a collection of objects, each a talisman, a memory, a story. A silver locket, its chain delicate and tarnished. A dried flower, preserved beyond reason. A tiny carved figurine of a bird, its wings spread mid-flight. Each item was a fragment of life, of moments she had witnessed and preserved while the world changed without her. The riders below shifted slightly, the soft clatter of hooves on stone echoing faintly. The tallest among them stepped forward, carrying a small leather-bound book, its pages worn but intact. He held it aloft, offering it silently to the woman. She recognized the craftsmanship immediately, the work of a hand she had known long ago, now long gone. A mixture of curiosity and caution tightened her chest as she considered what this gesture meant. The wind tugged at her cloak, lifting strands of silver hair around her face. Framing her timeless features against the morning sky, her mind raced, as it always did when others approached. Each visitor brought questions and intentions, some hidden, some obvious. She had learned over countless years that intentions were rarely pure, and that every encounter, even one filled with respect, could turn to disaster in a heartbeat. And yet, there was a weight in this moment, a pull that drew her gaze downward toward the riders, urging her to acknowledge them, to step beyond the shadow she had cultivated for so long. The tallest rider's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert held its breath. Then, with a subtle nod, the rider gestured to the others. The silent message was clear. They had come not just to find her, but to seek something she had hidden, something only she could offer, and perhaps something that had been waiting for them all along. She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the balcony railing. Today, the quiet that had protected her for decades would be broken, and the world beyond the Watchtower would reach inside in a way she had never anticipated.